History has not been fair to Antheil. Antheil has suffered, but frankly, Antheil was not fair to history either. One of the reasons he's suffered is because the autobiography that he wrote was, to a certain extent, a kind of tell-all autobiography. He insulted lots of his friends. He lied about many, many things in his life. He made up stories about himself. They're great stories. We love it. It's a great novel. George Antheil was probably one of the craziest composers of the 20th century.
No matter what he says about himself, what other people say about him, the guy took the idea of being a musician and participating in the grand musical tradition and passing this on to students. You know, he took all of this very seriously.
He's a man who's dear to my own heart because he was a great pianist, because he traveled a lot in Europe. He was somebody who was a huge innovator. He was somebody from Trenton who grew up in a modest, if not poor, background. He came from a family of shoe salesmen, and they had a little shop on Broad Street, I believe. But he dropped out of high school, and with that particular background and no education, no one assumed he was going anywhere. In fact, what happened is he went to Europe, and he was a huge hit, and that's why I love George Antheil.
He decided to go to Paris, and when he hit Paris, he realized he had found himself a home. He got to be a very high-profile figure. Everybody knew him, and he knew everybody. James Joyce, Ezra Pound. He and his wife lived in an apartment above Sylvia Beach's famous Shakespeare and Company, the bookstore in Paris, frequented by sort of all of the high-profile figures in the avant-garde at the time. Ezra Pound was a very early advocate.
Was the artistic center of the world during the 1920s. I mean, this was the place to be. And Antheil was at the top of that heap. Probably the most amazing work that Antheil wrote is called the Ballet, mécanique. And it was supposed to be the film score for a film by Fernand Léger, who was a big cubist of the time. What Antheil intended with his music in Ballet mécanique was to find a musical representation of the visuals that Fernand Léger was using.
It's a feeling of automatic function and an identification of machines as being part of us.
If you look at the film, if you look at the footage, it's constantly intercutting between images of triangles and circles that pop on and off the screen, of balls that reflect the camera in them, of swings, of machinery going, everything moving constantly in as many dimensions as possible. It was a huge scandal because it was probably the loudest piece, or one of the loudest pieces of the 20th century without amplification. It had 16-player pianos, it had 7 xylophones, an airplane propeller, 2 airplane propellers, 5 doorbells, and an electric siren.
We played it in Paris and had great success with it there from the viewpoint of riots and discussions. The critiques of the concert appeared on the front pages of Parisian newspapers instead of in the back pages, mostly because there were riots and people punched one another. And the surrealists who were violently on my side in one particular concert at the Champs-Élysées came in and punched everyone who didn't like the music.
Trenton was an industrial city at the time that he was growing up. There were steel mills and the ceramics plants, and it was all about production. There were ocean-going vessels docking in the Delaware River out here. He was able to somehow, in his music, I think, reflect that culture.
He didn't see anything wrong with machines. He loved them, and he thought that was a cause for optimism.
In some ways, it isn't the early music that appeals to me the most, which is kind of an unusual point of view. I happen to think that he improved quite a bit as a composer, that the stuff that he did sort of in the 30s and 40s and early 50s was in some ways a lot more interesting. It's a lot deeper.
If we look at a later piece, like the Cartoon Sonata, which is from the early 50s, there we see a whole different approach. He's still doing the intercutting. He's still got this kind of movie, cinematic approach to music, but it's much calmer. He went back to a very neoclassical kind of traditional music, and he managed to still integrate some of the fun and sarcasm of his earlier period.
He did have this whole other career as a composer of scores for Hollywood movies.
I wanted to, I could sell you a penthouse full of mink coats, and tomorrow you'd never see me again.
The sort of the received wisdom about these things is that he wrote the scores for some B movies for Hollywood. But if you look at the list of the movies that he actually wrote them for, you realize there's a kind of interesting consistency. Of the most prominent ones, I think all but one were composed for classic examples of film noir starring Humphrey Bogart.
He always had a kind of an eclectic professional life. He wrote a column for a magazine on advice to the lovelorn.
He kept getting involved all throughout his life in extra musical activities. Either he wanted to earn money, or he had this great idea and he thought that it would save the world, or he wanted to get rich quick. There was always some scheme that he had going in the background. Some of his inventions were so great that it's good that he did them. One of these was the torpedo control device, which he invented with Hedy Lamarr. They took out a patent in 1942 for a radical technology, which is now known as frequency hopping. And that technology enabled a torpedo, a guided missile, to be in touch with its base, with the guiding station on a ship or wherever it might be, without being jammed by enemy radar. A very, very key invention. And now that's all done. It's done in your local cell phone. Everybody's cell phone has this technology. It's done with electronics. But at the time, the only way to do it was using punched tape. And what does punched tape look like to a piano player but a piano player roll? And Antheil was the expert on piano player rolls. His hanging out with Hedy Lamarr and so on, it didn't really help his reputation in certain ways, because, you know, she was beautiful, she was a Hollywood starlet, and he had many, many blonde Hollywood starlet friends. He definitely had a certain reputation in Hollywood. Antheil was notorious in the 20s and for his antics, for his crazy stunts. And then he became well known as a composer in the 1950s. And if he had lived another 10 years, remember he died fairly young, he died when he was only 59 years old. If he had lived, we can imagine that he would have become maybe a more established, respected composer. He died at a bad time for his career. You could say that of a lot of people.